Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to episode number 13 of AWC's webinar series. Today we're going to be covering PFAS. My name is Alex Pacini. I'm the Business Development Manager here at AWC. Today our guest on the show is Mike Weatherill. We're going to be primarily presenting on PFAS. PFAS is a very broad topic, so because of that, we've kind of stuck it more to the 5 things you need to know on PFAS, so we've been pretty general. This is part of our webinar series, so for those who have been with us before, you'll see that these are some of the topics that we've covered. We've had to change the emerging contaminants list a little bit. Unfortunately, we had a cancellation, so we're kind of shuffling a little bit of that around. We're doing PFAS this week. You'll have a look at these are some of the emerging contaminants that we're going to be covering. Keep adding a few people here. These are the emerging contaminants that we're going to be covering as part of October. During the event of, we've got WEFTEC Connect going on at the same time, we've got Water Week, we thought emerging contaminants would be a good one to cover. For those of you that are new with us, AWC, who we are, AWC Water Solutions, we design and manufacture water treatment plants worldwide. So we've been around for 40 years. We have close to a little over 500 water treatment plants worldwide. We divvy them up into 3 separate categories. So we'll have our potable water, our wastewater, and skid mounted systems. So that's who we are. With that, we're going to go ahead and jump over to the PFAS. So welcome, Mike. Go ahead and take it away if you want to share your screen on your end.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for having me today. So hopefully you can see that.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so first me join you today to present on this very important topic, PFAS, and we're going to do this in kind of 2 parts. So part 1 today, we're going to cover most of the pertinent information on the background of PFAS. Again, this is a 20 presentation, so it's going to be a little bit condensed. A little bit about Purolite. We are the leading manufacturer of ion exchange resins in the world, and we manufacture 100% of our own products. And we have technical service reps and engineers located throughout the world and many offices. You can find your local representative by going to our website, purolite.com, and click on the locations tab, and you can talk directly to your local guy. We do work with AWC here in Canada. I'm located in Eastern Canada, and I believe Alex is out there in beautiful British Columbia. So let's get going on PFAS. There's some lag going on here. I apologize. Okay. So in the presentation, we're going to talk about what are PFAS, the sources of PFAS in water, a little bit about PFAS in North America, because that's where my experience is. Just going to touch on the health effects and the government guidelines, again, in North America. And then we're going to start on the PFAS removal options. And part 2 is where we'll go into a little bit more details on the specifics of the PFAS removal options. So what are PFAS? By now, you may have seen these complicated chemistry. They are long chain chemistry that's man-made. So PFAS are synthetic chemical that include a wide and diverse array of solutions containing fluorine and carbon. So that's a commonality for all of these things. They all contain fluorine and carbon. The reason they're a big topic in the world is because they are a proven carcinogenic impurity found in water, which has adverse health effects if ingested. This will actually impact every one of us. And there is growing concern across the world regarding the presence of levels of PFAS in drinking water supplies. So when we're talking about PFAS and the level of concern, it's actually parts per trillion levels that we're worried about. So it's not a parts per million or parts per billion, it's actually parts per trillion. So it's very small amounts of these chemicals will lead to adverse health effects. So there's a lot of information that you can find online about the specifics, but what I wanted to impact today is there's over 5,000 different varieties of these chemicals. And like I said, carbon and fluorine based. And then within that category, there's subcategories, the perfluorinated and the polyfluorinated. And then you can break that down even further into the carboxylic or the sulfonic or a few other groups as listed there. And then we're talking, about the terminology and the classifications of these chemicals. So there's something called the long chain PFAS, and they include the most common, the PFOS, octanic acid, and the PFOA. And these are the most common and most studied types, and also the most regulated throughout the world. There's another subcategory called the short chain PFAS, and these include the PFBS, PFHXA, and so on. And they are typically harder or more difficult to remove fully down to non-detect levels. The third subcategory would be Gen X, and it's just like it sounds. This is the trade name for the next generation of high-performance fluoropolymers, for instance, non-stick coatings, without PFOA or PFOS. So these are still PFAS chemicals. They just don't contain those two that are the most studied and regulated. The problem is they're all within the same category, and there are studies that are coming out that are proving a link between the Gen X PFAS chemicals and adverse health effects. So right now we know PFOA and PFOS are bad for us. They're bioaccumulative and they lead to problems. But there are new chemistries out there, and more each day we're discovering these chemicals have adverse problems if ingested. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is just another list of some of the common ones with your chemical formula, molecular weight, and their type. And on the far right side is the list if they're short chain or long chain. And as you can see at the bottom there, to categorize short or long chain, basically it's short chain if it's under 8 carbon chains, and on the sulfonic side if it's under 6. So where does this stuff come from? So now we know that they're a complicated chemistry that comes from industry. They're not a natural chemical that's found in nature. So where is it coming from? So a picture says 1,000 words. So most commonly, we see problems with PFAS contamination of drinking water around places that used a large amount of firefighting foams, as you can see there in the middle. These foams do a good job of suppressing fire, but the problem is after the fire has been put out, we don't collect these foams, and they actually end up seeping into the ground and contaminating the water supply with these PFAS chemicals. And that's why it's prevalent near military installations and airports. Obviously, if you're dropping bombs and putting the bombs out on a test range with these foams, you're going to use a large percentage of these foams. And that's why we're finding, when I say we, it's the industry, it's the world, we're finding PFAS much higher around military installations and airports. Also, if you have a large barn fire, for instance, you can contaminate a smaller area if you're using these foams and not properly disposing of them. Some other things that you find PFAS in are in adhesives, cosmetics, cleaning products, food packaging, and this is the one that hits home close for everyone because we all like our pizza and our occasional cheeseburger. So what I'm saying is I'm a water expert, and the production of these packaging types have some kind of waste component to it. Any coating on these papers may contain these PFAS chemicals. I don't know about the contact between the food and the containers, but I know when you're manufacturing these containers, you have to properly manage your waste streams and your wastewater to prevent it from polluting the environment. It's also from coatings on paper and fiberboard, so that waxy kind of coating that you see on cardboard, especially chemicals, including chrome plating. On the right hand, certain chromators use chemicals so they have a better adhesion of the chrome to whatever surface they're using. And again, you have to manage your wastewater properly to prevent environmental contamination. And then the last one I have on this list is the coatings on fabrics and paper. I work a lot in the oil industry, and I'm always wearing the Nomex, as you can see in the middle there. And there are some versions of these protective clothing that will have the PFAS chemicals in it. Again, I'm not saying it's an issue with contact through the skin, but I know when you're manufacturing these clothing, you're going to have some kind of wastewater you have to treat properly. So let's just drill down into North America a little bit. So there's a really good website that I'm going to show the link to on the next page. It's an organization, and you can actually pull up a map that shows the proven sites of PFAS contamination within the US. A lot of this data is driven from the US, but it is a worldwide problem. So you can see the purple dots are the military sites, and the blue are the drinking water, and the red are the other known sites, typically around industry. So you can find this map and click on each of those dots, and it'll tell you the proven amount or detection limit of the PFAS in these areas. So like I said, I'm from Eastern Canada, and there's not a lot of data in Canada yet. But when you drill down into the Great Lakes region, as we know, most of our fresh water in this part of the world comes from the Great Lakes. You can see around Michigan and other areas along the border have issues. So you can guarantee that there's some level of PFAS contamination in all water supplies in this area. And there's that link you can find, the map. It's a public knowledge thing, ewg.org, and you can find that online. So that's just North America. This is a worldwide problem. So that's what leads me to, why do we care about these chemicals? What's the big deal? Well, why do we care? Because parts per trillion in the water ends up being parts per billion in the blood. And like I mentioned before, it's bioaccumulative. So that means your body doesn't process it or get rid of it once it's in there. So if we have contaminated water, then some of that PFAS chemicals will be actually in our blood from drinking that water. And this is just a stat. By the early 2000s, PFOS had contaminated the blood of more than 95% of the human and wildlife in remote corners of the globe. So basically, it's in over 95% of the life out there. There's even been studies where they found PFAS in the blood of polar bears. So it's a problem, and it's not a large problem. I mean, it is a large problem, but we're talking parts per trillion levels here, so we have to deal with it. And then these are just some of the proven health effects that there's many studies. Again, you can find all these studies as public knowledge. I haven't put a link to it, but I'm just giving a quick overview here. So there are some links to reproductive and developmental side effects, restricted liver and kidney function, low infant birth weights, immune system depression, cancers, specifically from PFOA, include bladder, prostate, liver, and thyroid cancer, a higher rate of this when people have PFAS in their blood, and hormone disruption from PFOS. So these are all the things that have been proven, both on some on human studies, but many others on animal studies. More and more studies are coming out all the time, and this has become a very public knowledge problem. There are a couple Hollywood blockbusters, including a movie on Netflix that you can look up about this specific problem. So let's talk about what the governments are doing about it. So the governments are putting in MCLs or MACs. So this is just a quick list of some of the major states in the US, and then I've listed Canada at the bottom. So in 2016, the US EPA actually lowered their limit down to 70 parts per trillion for the two main impurities. And then other states have actually made their guidelines more stringent. In Canada, we are still with the old guideline of 600 and 200 of PFOS and PFOA, but it has been tabled to lower it down to the 70 to match the US EPA guideline. So here's just a graphical representation of that same data. As you can see, before in 2009 and prior, the limit was 600 by the EPA. In 2016, they lowered it to 70. And then you can see what the states have done specifically to their areas. So some of these states may have a bigger problem. For instance, Michigan, as we saw on that previous map, has a big problem. So they've actually have the most aggressive limits, all the way under 10 parts per trillion. Basically, what I'm trying to get across here is there's a global trend to lower the limits of these chemicals. So not only are we detecting these chemicals in more and more water supplies, the regulatory boards are becoming more and more strict about this, so we can prevent it from getting into the human and the animal population. So since this is a quicker discussion today, I'm just going to do a quick overview of the removal options, and part 2 that we're going to schedule for a later date will go into more details. So the good news is we know how to deal with these impurities from water. So there are some emerging options and technologies such as foam fractionation that's showing some promise. Most of these are in the very small scale or the pilot stage, but they seem to have some pretty good ability of capturing and removing PFAS chemicals. Membrane filtration does work, so that's an example of a reverse osmosis machine. So RO will remove PFAS chemicals, mostly the long chain, but I believe the short chain as well has some effectiveness. But the problem with an RO system is you have between 25 and up to 50% rejection. So you have to actually collect that reject water that has a higher concentration of the PFAS chemicals and dispose of that as liquid waste. There are some good ion exchange resins that are methanol and brine regenerable, and that's where my expertise comes in, working for Purolite for the last 10 years. Again, they work very effectively, but you have the regenerant, so you have to actually collect the methanol and the brine, which will have the higher levels of the PFAS, and then you have some liquid waste disposal again. So the two most popular technologies out there currently and that are advancing are the last two. So one of the main ones currently would be carbon absorption. And these were the traditional way of removing the two main PFOA and PFOS. And there are many installations out there. And of course, it all works down to cost, right? So just one example of operating costs of running a big carbon system for a full PFAS removal would be about 45 cents per 1,000 gallons. And this is just one example. Every system and every water source will have a different equation. Then it brings us to the single-use resin. So we at Purolite have formulated two very special resins that have very high capacity for PFAS. These resins work very well. They have over 99.99% of all PFAS reductions down to non-detect for at least some capacity. So down to non-detect. So basically with the resin option, you're completely removing it. With carbon, it's down to a set point typically. With resin, because you have a lower empty bed contact time requirement, you have up to 50% lower equipment footprint. So you need less media to do the same amount of flow or water flow. Much greater capacity with the ion exchange resin. So you have fewer system changeouts. And it's the best overall operating expense. So it works out to be, in this same example, about 26 cents per 1,000 gallons. So most of our data is proving that this is the most cost effective. So the way it works with resin, and part two is going to go into more detail, but it's a single-use resin with very high capacity to remove all of these nasty PFAS chemicals. Once the resin has been completely loaded with these chemicals, you have to take the resin out and deal with it as solid waste. So instead of liquid waste, like the three options at the top, you have a solid waste that you have to actually dispose of. The good news is this resin can be incinerated, and if this incineration process is a high enough temperature, it's a complete destruction of the PFAS from the environment. So like I mentioned a couple times, part two, the date will be to be determined with Alex from AWC. And in part two, we'll go into more of the design parameters and some case studies. So that's all the content I had for today, Alex. So if you want to take back control, and we can open up for some questions.
Thank you, Mike. It looks like we're actually right on time. That's a first. So we can go ahead and open it up for questions if anybody has some questions. I know sometimes you can either turn your camera on or turn your mic on, or if you want, just punch it into the chat box. But while everybody, drums up the courage to pick something up, I do have a couple questions for you. I guess the first one is we're primarily focusing on the water side. However, we are potentially incinerating it if we're going to go that way. What about airborne? Because we're measuring it in parts per trillion, can PFAS or PFOAs be airborne?
That's actually a good question. There is some evidence of soil contamination, and not necessarily soil contamination near a waste site of proven PFAS. So there is some indication that it may have some kind of airborne component, but I'm a water expert, so I can really only give you advice on the water contamination. So, right.
Okay. And then another question was more on the testing. Like, we're testing down to parts per trillion. So, whether we're going to a US EPA standard of 70 parts per trillion, or you're going after Michigan or California, where they're going down in the 10 parts per trillion. And I know, Matthew, I also have you on the line. How hard is it to test for PFAS down to, say, 10 parts per trillion?
So that's another good question, and I'll let Matthew comment as well, but the technology is getting better and better. If you asked me that 2 or 3 years ago, I would say it's very different. More and more test methods and equipment are coming out for these specific chemicals. There are most credible labs nowadays will have some kind of capacity to do this testing. So I don't have specifics on the testing, but it's getting better. That's what I can say.
All right, so here we go. We have a question here from Amy. I might have to reword this a little bit. And it was about RO. So we're going to be touching how to treat PFAS at a later date where we have a little bit more time. So we can 20 minutes on different methods of treating it. But in this particular question, it's how do you treat the PFAS from the RO brine? So I guess the way I understand it is you're using reverse osmosis for PFAS removal. You've got your brine concentration. How would you treat that? Because you're going to have very high concentration of PFAS coming off of your brine.
Yeah, and that's, like I said, there is going to be a component of liquid waste disposal for an RO or a regenerable system. So that liquid waste will have to be dealt with a hazmat company. There are ways, I think some people are working on ways to precipitate these chemicals, but that's very early. And you can actually incinerate liquid waste as well. So it's definitely more costly and complicated. And the big difference is it's the volume. So when you have in a large system like I was showing, maybe 100 cubic feet, 200 cubic feet of resin in each vessel, that's a much easier thing to volume of waste that you can deal with than if you had 25 to 50% RO reject to deal with.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Well, if anybody else has any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box. Mike and I will stick around. This is kind of the wrap up. We are at 22 minutes, so we're right on time. I do want to invite everybody for next week's webinar. It's number 14 next Thursday at 10 o'clock Pacific Standard Time, 1 o'clock EST. We're going to have somebody from the Rutgers University doing a presentation on microplastics. Again, it's 5 things you need to know about microplastics and how they're an ongoing concern. If you don't already follow us on LinkedIn, please make sure you follow us there. We have recently launched the YouTube channel where all the recordings are listed. I recently posted a link in there, so you can go ahead and have a look at them, whether you want to replay this episode or go back and have a look at the episodes. I know that right now what's showing up right now in there, it has them kind of out of order. YouTube doesn't organize it by name. Primarily it does it by how popular it is, so some are more popular than others. But they're all going to be in there. They're all going to be posted by tomorrow, and I'll go ahead and share a link in there. Oh, I have one more question before we wrap it up. Let's have a look. So Diana asks, does the OPEX cost of one-time use resin include solid waste disposal costing, hauling, accepting facility, etc.?
Okay,
So
that's a really good question.
Carbon.
Yep. So that specific study is based on a real life application. It is proprietary, so I can't give the actual site name, but factored into that is labor, freight for the media to and from, incineration, the actual media itself, and the testing equipment and depreciation of that said equipment. So in that example, and it was a one-time example based on their footprint and their water, it worked out to be all of those things, and it was about half the cost for that one. Another thing I'd like to mention is if you have an existing system that's using carbon and you want to polish it and use a resin as a last step, that's a common thing to do nowadays. So that's an option for existing systems that may or may not be in compliance anymore. You can put resin at the end as a polisher as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll make sure to be covering that. Again, this week we're on emerging contaminants. So we are doing PFAS, microplastics, 1,4-dioxane, and I know I'm always missing one, and cyanotoxins. So thank you everybody for making it this week. Thank you very much for taking 20 minutes of your time to do it. If anybody has any other questions, you can stick around, and Mike and I will be here for another few minutes. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. We're going to turn off the recording because that's how we wrap up. So thanks again, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.